Hello, today's video is going to look at the poem My Father Would Not Show Us by the unfortunately named poet Ingrid de Kok. However, this poet deserves to be remembered for more than having a mildly humorous surname, because this is a really well-crafted, a beautifully crafted poem exploring the narrator's conflicting, confused feelings towards her father and her own childhood. Now, as much as I love this poem, I find it spellbinding, frankly. This is not going to be a loving homage to it. It's rather going to be a kind of ruthless swoop over it, pulling out 2 or 3 key features of language and structure. And I know a lot of exam boards now expect you to look at contextual factors, so I'll also be looking at a few relevant features of the poet's life that we can consider in relation to the poem. The focus then is going to be very much on quality over quantity. However, if you think my exploration of this poem is a touch on the scanty side, trust me, the exam paragraphs at the end of this video, written to A star or level 9 standards, whatever they're calling this week, they will convince you that you can do an awful lot with a little. Now bear in mind when you're watching this video that this is simply my perception, my interpretation of this poem. I'm not giving you any of this, you've tried the rest, now try the best, rubbish. This is simply my ideas on the poem. There's a great line by a guy called John Hartley. The reality you observe depends on how you look at it. I mean, they sometimes say one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. There's more than one way of looking at something. And there's certainly more than one way of looking at a poem. There are certainly more than one valid interpretations for a poem. There are some wonderful interpretations of this poem swirling around on the internet and in the classroom. This is just mine. And trust me, even if you don't agree with it, it will hold up in an exam. Now, to avoid copyright wranglings with Ingrid de Kok, I'm not printing her poem here, My Father Would Not Show Us, but I'm going to give us an overview, and of course I'll quote from sections of it when we're doing the analysis later. This is the overview. In a morgue or a hospital or a funeral parlour, the narrator sees the body of her 5 days dead father, and she reflects on his character, her childhood, and how the former affected the latter, how the dad's character affected her childhood. She explains that her father hid his suffering and his thoughts and feelings about death. The title, My Father Would Not Show Us, this is explained to some extent on lines 16. And when it comes to considering why her father behaved this way, there are a couple of interpretations which we'll go into later in the video. So here's the first of 3 language techniques identified in the poem. This one's metaphor. On line 4, you've got the line, "It's cold in here." And this line can be read literally and metaphorically because she's viewing her father's body, as I say, at the morgue or the hospital. You have to keep the temperature low in places like this to preserve the body, stops them rotting. So this might just be a reference, this line, to the low temperature in the building. However, it can be read metaphorically. The coldness might allude to the lack of love she feels in the relationship with her father, or a generic lack of emotion in that relationship with her father. Language feature 2. Ooh, ambiguous language. I tell you now, an examiner sees you talk about ambiguous language in an exam, he pushes his reading glasses to the top of his nose, he starts focusing that a little bit more diligently. Ambiguous simply means there's more than one meaning to it. On lines 10 and 11, I believe the poet Ingrid de Kok is deliberately ambiguous. She says, "This is the last time I'm allowed to remember my childhood as it might have been." She doesn't say as it was, she says as it might have been. Now, one interpretation here is that because maybe she's an older narrator, the word might alludes to a vague memory. When you get to Mr. Taylor's age, your youth's a long, long time ago. We're talking before internet and iPods. So, your mind can play tricks on you. Your recollections of your youth might not actually accord with how they really were. Was the narrator's childhood then the louder, braver place that she recollects? But of course, this being ambiguous language, there is an alternative meaning. Perhaps the narrator suggests that her father hindered her from experiencing a vibrant childhood. This is the last time I'm allowed to remember my childhood as it might have been, as in it might have been a joyful youth had it not been for my dad. I said earlier on in this video that the character of the father had an impact or effect on the narrator's childhood. So let's focus a little bit more on the father's character or nature. Again, we've got ambiguous language intentionally employed to present the father's character. Line 15 is rich in ambiguity. The narrator states that she recalls from childhood her father's wry smile, his half-turned face. Let's start with the positive interpretation. One interpretation is that he was a warm-hearted man, because wry can suggest an indulgent smile on his face. Also, if he's facing towards them, it implies a degree of engagement and attachment to his family. But we're mining the ambiguity here, so there is naturally a secondary interpretation. This one's a little bit more negative, a little bit darker. Alternatively, this line, the father's wry smile, his half-turned face, can convey the father's cold, aloof nature, since he was a little bit distant from his family. Wry can mean mocking, which conveys a sense of sneering or condescension towards his family. And this idea is supported if the face is turned away from the family, entrenching that idea of his distant, detached manner. All in all then, the two examples of ambiguous language create a sense of vagueness, of confusion, as if the narrator isn't entirely sure what she recalls about her father, what she feels about him, how she feels about her childhood. Moving on to the structural features. From lines 1 to 15, the structure of the poem is characterised by free verse, meaning that there's no regular line length or rhyme scheme. It's, I guess, a more unpredictable style of poetry. You don't know what is going to be the structure of the next line. And this lack of order that's ushered in by the free verse heightens the sense of confusion that the narrator feels about her father, and the confusion about what she recalls about her father. We've seen two instances of ambiguous language leading to confused and conflicting ideas on the father, on her childhood. And this free verse, this poetic structure, reflects or complements or shores up that sense of disordered feelings and thoughts. The second structural feature we'll look at is repetition. The phrase, "my father would not show us," appears 3 times in this poem. Firstly is the title, secondly in line 16, and finally, although with one significant word change, on line 25. Now the title is intentionally intriguing. My father would not show us. What? What would he not show them? It could be anything, couldn't it? It draws the reader in. It could also allude, though, to the father's protective instincts, his wish to conceal something from the family for their own security, for their own peace of mind. The repetition of this phrase on line 16 clarifies for the reader the significance of the title. Line 16, "my father would not show us how to die." Now there are 2 interpretations that immediately bob up in that lump of gristle I have the gall to call a mind. The first interpretation is that owing to the father's reserved or taciturn nature, the fact that he's very uncommunicative by nature, this compels him to conceal how he feels from his family. He doesn't want them to share his problems. He's very private. The second interpretation is that urge to conceal isn't born of his character, but of his protective instincts. This man is a father. He doesn't want his children to suffer, and so he is concealing, in this secondary interpretation, the father is concealing the pain and the anguish of his own situation from his children, from his family, purely as a means of limiting their pain. Line 25, there's a switcheroo. The word would is substituted for could. So line 25 reads, "my father could not show us how to die." Perhaps this alludes to what we've already said. The father's uncommunicative, taciturn, private nature means that he was incapable. He could not show them and share with them his experiences of dying. Alternatively, the poet is projecting here a universal message, a message about death that goes beyond the situation of herself and her father. She's generalising about death, perhaps, and perhaps she's saying that because death is such an intensely personal journey, how you die is going to be very different to how I die, both in terms of method and the attitude with which we face death, because death is such an intensely personal experience, a solo flight, if you will, nobody can really give you any guidance on how to face and experience death. Now, if your exam board, your examiner, is forcing you to address contextual factors to link information about the poet and the period when the poem was written to the text, then have a good goggle at these 3 bullet points. Ingrid de Kok, a South African woman, a political poet. A lot of her poetry originally focusing on the injustice of apartheid, fighting the good fight against racism in South Africa. But there are a lot of poems that she's written that address more personal themes, such as childhood, her own childhood and that of her sons. And there's one particular poem, Frightened of the Dark. I think this is addressed to her brother, and there's an allusion here to their youth, and I think there's a reference to a dead father too. Right, Mr. Taylor, well, you've done a first-class job of analysing the language and the structure of this poem, added to which you've made our souls sing with those fascinating facts about the poet's life. What is this gubbins in blue you show me now? This is a top standard paragraph, a response, exam style, to a question. Perhaps a question that says something like, how does the poet present feelings towards her father? Or how does the poet present feelings towards somebody she loves? I'll have a read of it and then we'll look at why it is so damn good. In My Father, the narrator effectively uses ambiguous language to present her feelings towards her father. She speaks of his wry smile, his half-turned face. There are a multiplicity of meanings here. On the one hand, it implies to the reader her father's warm-hearted nature, because wry can mean amused. Supporting this idea, we can infer that he is half-turned towards her, suggesting an engaged, attentive father. Alternatively, ... Now you better believe that this is a paragraph shaped to make an examiner drool like a dog at dinner time, and I've highlighted some words now so we can see just what I've done to make it such an effective piece. Well, first I'll refer to the person in the poem as the narrator. I've not assumed it's the poet. That can be a dangerous assumption. If in doubt, call it the persona, the narrator, the speaker. Narrator works for me. Effectively, I've put in there, because a lot of exam boards now ask you to evaluate a poem or the poetic techniques. So effectively suggests the poet is doing this quite well. I've cited the language technique, ambiguous language, and I've used a key word from the question, which was something like, how does the poet present feelings towards a loved one? I've got that word present in there, and feelings too. His wry smile, his half-turned face, I've embedded the quote here. I've not just said, in My Father, the narrator effectively uses ambiguous language to present her feelings towards the father. Wry smile, his half-turned face. I've said she speaks of his wry smile, his half-turned face. This just creates a bit of flow and fluency because I've woven that quotation into my own sentence. I could have just said, she states, wry smile, half-turned face. It just creates a bit of fluency. There are a multiplicity of meanings. That is a fancy down way of saying there is more than one interpretation to this bit of evidence. It implies a great launch pad for your explanation, and I know a lot of times now you've got to say that the effect is to the reader as opposed to an emperor penguin or a ship's biscuit. It implies to the reader. I always thought that went without saying, apparently not. It implies to the reader. Sometimes you have to be explicit. Certainly with the Excel exam board you have to be explicit about that. And I've given the effect there. It implies to the reader her father's warm-hearted nature. I've locked in a key word there. I've said wry means amused. Examiners love it when you can do that. You kind of pluck out a piece of language and consider its meaning and its connotations. Supporting this idea, we can infer. Infer is another way of launching into our explanation. This is a secondary interpretation as well, because of course I'm looking at a second piece of evidence in the evidence. You can bet the farm the examiner loves that. We can infer that he is half turned towards her, suggesting an engaged, attentive father. So I've given a secondary interpretation there, the secondary explanation. Carrying on from that first paragraph, alternatively, the line conveys to the reader a sense of the father's aloof, cold nature, because wry can mean mocking, suggesting a sense of superiority and condescension towards his family. This idea is shored up by the term half turned, which may suggest he was turned away from them in a detached and distant manner. I won't bother explaining the underlying bits and bobs here. Feel free, if you wish, to pause the video and consider why I've highlighted certain phrases and words here. What are these building blocks of a good quality paragraph? So that's it then. We're all done. We can all whiz off to the cafe for a frappa mocha latte with extra soy milk. Hold the wedding, Mr. Taylor, you knucklehead. What about these contextual factors that exam boards are increasingly asking of their students? Why haven't you woven those into your paragraph? Alright then, how about this then? I've done it in black, a contextual link at the end. Ingrid de Kok was born in South Africa, 1951. How's that? Can I have my coffee now? Not really, no. And I'll tell you why. Because it's utter bobbins. How is that a relevant contextual link? You're not writing a dating profile here. You're supposed to be making a relevant link between the poet's life or the era when the poem was written and your ideas on the text. As they say in the Punch and Judy shows, that's the way to do it. This paragraph written in black is relevant context. It links explicitly to the ideas explored in the poem. I'll have a quick read. With a reputation as a political poet, critical of the old apartheid regime in South Africa, my father can be seen as a change in direction for de Kok. However, this poem links to another of her poems, Frightened of the Dark, which explores childhood fears and the theme of dead fathers. You can see then that this is not just bolt-on material, cut and pasted from Wikipedia, but information about the poet's life linking clearly to the ideas expressed in previous paragraphs. And that's us, folks. My Father Would Not Show Us by Ingrid de Kok. Language, structure and context done and dusted.